How do you find hope when the world is crumbling all around you? Amid the thunder of distant bombs and the flickering shadows cast by blackout curtains, Eleanor Nell Whitaker poured tea for a line of grim-faced soldiers, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. London's nights had become a blur of air raid sirens and hurried footsteps, of huddled strangers exchanging nervous smiles beneath the hum of danger overhead. Yet in those moments, inside the cramped, smoky canteen on Chancery Lane, something softer persisted. The fragile warmth of connection blooming even as the city burned. The canteen's gas lamps cast a yellow haze over the room, illuminating dust motes that danced above battered tables and chipped teacups. Soldiers in muddied uniforms queued for sandwiches and sweet, milky tea, their voices low, laughter forced. Against the backdrop of war, every meeting felt precious and perilous, each goodbye tinged with the knowledge that it might be the last. Nell moved among them, her brown hair pinned back, apron smudged with flour and tea stains, offering tired encouragement and quick smiles. She was determined not to let her fear show. Outside, the night air carried the metallic tang of smoke and the distant echo of anti-aircraft fire. Nell's thoughts flickered to her father, coughing in the cramped flat above their family's battered bookshop, and to her mother, who kept the business afloat despite shelves left half empty by rationing and bomb damage. The storefront's glass had shattered in a recent raid, replaced now by plywood and a handwritten sign, "Open for stories, tea, and hope." For Nell, the canteen was both an escape and an obligation, a way to help, to matter, to remind herself that kindness could survive even here. Tonight, as the clock neared 11, a fresh group of soldiers shuffled inside, boots leaving a trail of mud and rainwater across the linoleum. Among them was a man who looked a little older than the rest, his uniform as rumpled as his expression was open. He hesitated near the entrance, taking in the room with a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. His hair, dark and unruly, was pushed damply from his forehead, and his hands were red from cold. Nell caught his eye, offering a mug of steaming tea. "You look as if you could use this more than most," she said, her voice gentle but clear above the din. He smiled, the expression slow to bloom but genuine. "Thank you, miss. Feels like I haven't been warm in weeks." She passed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "It's only jam, I'm afraid. We're out of ham again." The man shook his head. "Jam's a feast after a week of army stew." He glanced around, unsure where to sit. The canteen was crowded, every table crowded with men hunched over their mugs. Nell gestured toward an empty chair at the end of the counter. "What's your name?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sam. Sam Linwood." His northern accent softened the edges of his words. "From Yorkshire originally." She nodded, recognizing the lilt. "I'm Nell, Whitaker. I work here most nights. Well, when I'm not minding the family shop." Sam's gaze lingered on her for a moment, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "A bookshop? In London? That's brave these days." Nell shrugged, a rueful smile tugging at her lips. "It's mostly patchwork and hope now. Still, people need stories, maybe more than ever." He sipped his tea, wincing as the heat hit his tongue. "I used to teach. Little village school back home. Reading to the children was my favorite part." She brightened, drawn to the image. "You must miss it." "Every day," Sam said quietly. "But you do what you must." Their conversation was interrupted by another siren, long, low, insistent, prompting a ripple of unease through the canteen. Nell set her jaw, determined not to show fear. "We'll be all right," she said, mostly to herself. For the next hour, Nell worked in a blur, serving tea, fetching blankets, offering reassurance to the anxious and the wounded. She caught glimpses of Sam across the room, quietly helping her stack crates of tinned milk and condensed soup, his movements careful, as if he was afraid to disturb the fragile peace they'd created inside these cramped walls. Later, as midnight approached and the soldiers prepared to return to their barracks or the underground shelters, Sam lingered by the counter, a battered knapsack slung over one shoulder. "Thank you, Nell," he said, voice thick with something more than fatigue. "For the tea and for talking to me." She reached beneath the counter, pulling out a dog-eared book, an anthology of poetry, its spine cracked, pages marked with pencil. "Take this, something to keep you company wherever you're sent." He accepted it, surprise and gratitude mingling in his eyes. Thank you. I'll take good care of it. Promise me you'll read it, she said, fighting the sudden urge to say more. Poems are stubborn. They survive things we can't imagine. He nodded, tucking the book into his bag. I promise. Their hands brushed briefly as she passed him the book. Neither spoke of the future or what the next day might bring. The war had taught them both that plans were paper-thin, easily torn. Still, as Sam disappeared into the damp, smoky night, Nell felt a strange flutter of hope, small, insistent, impossible to ignore. London, in those years, was a city of broken things. The streets bore scars from bombings, piles of brick and twisted metal, shopfronts boarded up or reduced to rubble. Rationing emptied larders and made luxuries of butter and eggs. Blackout curtains hung in every window, heavy with the smell of dust and fear. Yet amid the hardship, life persisted. Children played hopscotch on cracked pavements. Neighbours shared what little sugar or coal they had. And in the Whitaker bookshop, Nell's mother lit candles at dusk, reading aloud to her husband as he coughed in the shadows. Nell's own days blurred together. Mornings spent cleaning glass from the shop floor, afternoons queuing for bread or carrying parcels to neighbours, evenings in the canteen pouring tea, lending a listening ear. She wrote letters for illiterate soldiers, patched uniforms, and gathered news from the radio, always searching for word of friends fighting abroad. Her father's illness, just a touch of the lungs, he insisted, kept him bedridden, leaving Nell to shoulder more of the family burden. Still, she refused to let despair root in her heart. Some nights, when the city was quiet and the all-clear sounded, Nell stood by the attic window, peering over rooftops to the Thames, watching searchlights sweep the sky. She wondered about the men who passed through the canteen, where they went, what they feared, whether they ever found sleep beneath the roar of enemy planes. A week after she'd given Sam the poetry book, Nell found a note tucked between its pages, returned to the shop by a runner in an army cap. She recognized his handwriting, firm, slightly slanted, careful. Dear Nell, thank you for the book. I've read the first poem so many times I think I could recite it by heart. The words keep me company when the nights are loud and the world feels far away. I hope you're safe. I hope you're finding something to smile about, even now. Yours, Sam. The letter was short, but Nell read it over and over, struck by its quiet sincerity. In a world where so much was uncertain, Sam's words felt like an anchor, something to hold on to when fear threatened to pull her under. That night, she wrote back, her hand trembling slightly as she searched for the right words. She told him about the shop, how she'd rescued a stray cat from the cellar, how her mother insisted on making doilies from old ration books. She described the canteen, the soldiers she met, the small kindnesses that stitched each day together. She quoted a line from the poetry book, one about hope persisting like wildflowers in rubble. She signed it simply, Yours, Nell. Thus began something neither of them had planned. Letters at first tentative, then longer, more revealing. Sam wrote from a training camp in Kent. Muddy fields, early mornings, the ache of missing home. Nell replied with stories of London life, the way the city refused to be cowed, and the strange beauty of dawn after a night of bombing. Their words bridged miles and fear, building a connection as fragile and precious as glass. As autumn bled into winter, the war dragged on. News from the front was grim, losses mounting each week. Nell's father worsened, his cough deepening. The shop survived another near miss, its windows rattling in the shockwave of a bomb that destroyed the bakery at the corner. Nell took on more shifts at the canteen, her hands red and raw from scrubbing. Still, she waited for Sam's letters, treasuring each envelope as if it held a piece of herself. One evening, as she closed up the shop, sorting through a stack of battered books to salvage any that might sell, she found another note tucked into the poetry anthology. A new letter from Sam, written in pencil, the paper creased and stained. Dear Nell, we're shipping out soon. They don't tell us much, but there's talk of France, maybe Belgium. I keep your poem with me, folded in my pocket. It reminds me of home, of things worth coming back to. If you find time, write back. Your words help more than you know. Sam. Nell pressed her palm to the page, feeling the weight of his vulnerability. She wanted to tell him everything, that she worried for him, that the city felt emptier without his quiet presence, that she looked for him in every tired face that passed through the canteen. But she held back, afraid of seeming foolish or desperate. Instead, she wrote simply, "I'll be waiting, right when you can." The days grew colder. Food was scarcer. Ration books worn thin. Queues stretching around corners in the rain. Nell's mother sent her to the countryside for eggs and potatoes, and Nell spent hours on crowded trains, pressed between strangers clutching baskets and gas masks. She thought of Sam, wondering if he too watched the fields blur past from a train window, longing for home. At night, Nell dreamed of letters, of words that crossed oceans and battlefields, finding their way through darkness and danger. She woke each morning to the thud of the postman's boots on the stairs, heart leaping at the sight of a foreign stamp or Sam's careful script. Life in wartime was measured in small hopes: the taste of real sugar in tea, the warmth of a borrowed coat, a letter arriving safe and whole. Nell clung to these things, refusing to let grief or fear define her. If the world was ending, she decided, she would meet it with open eyes and an open heart. And so in the battered heart of London, while bombs fell and sirens wailed, two strangers stitched a fragile lifeline between them, one letter at a time, each word a quiet rebellion against the darkness. The war would test them, threaten to sever what little they'd built. But for now, Nell held fast to hope, believing, as she always had, that stories and love could survive anything. The first cold weeks of 1943 pressed in around Nell like an extra layer of clothing. Heavy, necessary, sometimes suffocating. In London, winter seemed to soak into the bones, and the battered city wore its scars openly. Windowless storefronts patched with plywood, stretches of rubble where familiar landmarks once stood, walls pockmarked with shrapnel and soot. Nell's father, grown more frail since the last raid, spent his days in the little apartment above what was left of Whitaker's books, his cough echoing through the floorboards. Nell moved quietly about the flat, careful not to wake him as she prepared tea and sorted ration coupons at the kitchen table. But every few days hope arrived, sometimes smudged with mud, sometimes with the faintest whiff of tobacco or field grass, always addressed in the same careful hand. Samuel Linwood. The first letter had come tucked inside the battered poetry volume she'd pressed into his palm a few days before his regiment shipped out. Nell had found it wedged between the last pages, her name scrawled in pencil on the front. The words were awkward, almost apologetic. He wrote of gratitude, of the comfort of verses during sleepless nights, and of a wish, half-formed, never quite spoken, to write again soon. She replied, shy at first, filling her letter with news from the canteen, with fragments of daily life, the shortage of eggs, the new blackout warden with the comically large whistle, the way laughter sometimes burst out among the volunteers like birds startled from a hedge. She slipped in a line of poetry too, uncertain if he'd notice. Now, months later, their letters stretched like a lifeline between London and wherever the army sent Sam. First, a sodden camp in Kent, then a training ground in Wiltshire, and finally across the Channel to France. The letters were never quite regular, but their rhythm became as familiar as the chime of the clock in the hallway. Dear Nell, I miss the sound of rain against the window at home. The fields here are flat and endless, and the wind carries the scent of unfamiliar grass. Yesterday one of the lads taught me to play cards, badly I'm afraid. I still have your book, though it's grown rather battered. I read a poem each night before lights out. Sam, sometimes his words were light, almost teasing. Sometimes they grew somber, shadowed by the loneliness of night or the weight of a friend's absence. Nell learned to read between the lines, to sense when he wrote by candlelight in a quiet lull or quickly, with an officer hovering nearby. She answered with stories of London's stubborn resilience, of Mrs. Pennington, who'd lost her roof but still showed up for every shift at the canteen, of her father's slow recovery, of the stray cat that had adopted them, curling up on the shop's battered cash register as if it could will customers back through the door. She wrote of longing too, carefully at first, then with more honesty as the months passed. Of the way the city seemed to shrink around her, the silence of the bookshop at night, of the ache for things she couldn't name. Once she slipped a pressed violet into her envelope. For luck, she wrote. And because the city is all grey and noise, and I thought you might miss a bit of colour. He replied with a dried blade of grass from a French field, and a line of Wordsworth copied in his looping hand. As spring edged into summer, Nell's world shifted again. Her father's cough became more insistent, his hands too shaky to count the coins in the till. The doctor, a stoic man with tired eyes, suggested that the country air might give him a chance to recover. There were cousins in Yorkshire who had offered rooms and quiet. Nell packed what she could, a battered suitcase, a few books, a ration tin, and the letters. Sam's letters tied in a red ribbon she'd found in a drawer. She wrote to Sam about the move, about the guilt that gnawed at her for leaving London behind, about her hopes for her father's health. The train north was crowded with evacuees and soldiers on leave, the windows fogged with breath and anticipation. Yorkshire was colder, cleaner, emptier. The air smelled of peat smoke and distant rain. The cousins were kind, if a little reserved, and the village itself seemed untouched by the war, at least at first glance. But the ration queues were just as long, and every window wore its crosshatched tape like a badge. Nell found work in the village post office then, when word spread that she could type and had a good head for puzzles, at the code office in a nearby town. The work was secretive and exhausting, but she welcomed the distraction. Each evening she wrote to Sam by candlelight, her words tumbling over one another in her eagerness to share the details of this new life. Sam's letters, too, changed in tone. The soldier who had once written shyly of poetry and home now confided his fears. The monotony of marching, the brief terror of shell fire, the ache of missing faces at roll call. He wrote of his students back in Yorkshire, wondering if the schoolhouse windows still gleamed in the morning light, if the blackboard still bore his chalk marks. Nell read every word, her heart tightening with each new absence he hinted at, each friend lost or reassigned. The war became more than noise and headlines. It became the names Sam wrote in his careful script, the dreams he confessed in the quiet between battles. But the letters did not always arrive in order or on time. Some came weeks late, edges worn from handling, the censor's black lines crossing out names and places. Others never arrived at all, and Nell learned to live with the ache of not knowing, of waiting for an answer that might never come. One day a letter arrived from Sam, the envelope bearing stains and the marks of multiple post offices. The writing inside was shaky. "Dear Nell, I'm writing this from a field hospital near Caen. Nothing to worry about, just a bit of shrapnel in the leg. The nurses are kind, and the food is, by army standards, edible. I keep thinking of home, of the way the sun looks when it comes through the clouds over the dales. I miss you, I hope you're well." Sam Nell's hands trembled as she read. She wrote back at once, her words urgent, desperate for reassurance, but the days dragged on without a reply. Outside, the rumors grew of an imminent invasion, of new offensives on the continent. The code office buzzed with activity, the air thick with tension. Nell deciphered messages late into the night, her mind clouded with exhaustion and worry. Her father's health wavered. Some days he seemed almost himself, arguing gently over the merits of Dickens versus Eliot. Other days he slept for hours, his breath shallow and uneven. Nell felt herself stretched thin, caught between duty and longing, between Yorkshire's quiet fields and the bombed-out streets of London that haunted her dreams. The letters from Sam slowed. Sometimes weeks would pass with nothing but silence, her own words unanswered. She found herself carrying his last note everywhere, the paper soft and creased from reading and rereading. When she did hear from him, his letters were shorter, the handwriting rushed. He mentioned being reassigned, of the days blurring together, of missing home with a fierceness I didn't know I had. Once he included a scrap of a poem, half remembered, his own words filling in the gaps. "When distance grows between us, let each letter be a bridge." A whisper in the dark, a promise, a hope. The ache of not knowing gnawed at Nell. She tried to lose herself in work, in the rhythm of code and cipher, but every message she translated, every cryptic phrase, seemed to echo with Sam's absence. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Nell sat at her cousin's kitchen table, her pen poised above the paper. She wanted to write something honest, something that might break through the silence. She started, stopped, crumpled the paper, began again. "Dear Sam, I don't know where you are as I write this. I don't know if this letter will reach you. Sometimes I think of the first time we met in the canteen, with the world falling apart around us, and you so quiet, so steady. I wish you could see Yorkshire now. The heather on the hills, the way the light moves over the fields. I miss you. I think of you every night. There, I've written it. It feels like standing at the edge of something, waiting for the wind to carry my words across the miles between us. Nell. She hesitated before sealing the envelope, her heart pounding. Should she send it? Was it foolish to hope for more when the world itself seemed so uncertain, so fragile? She pressed the paper to her lips as if that could carry her longing all the way to France. Days passed, weeks. The rumors of invasion became headlines. Nell's work grew more intense, decoding, filing, relaying messages, always with the sense that something vast and terrible was drawing closer. At night, she dreamed of London, of bookshelves and broken glass, of Sam's voice reading poetry in the half-light. Her father's health stabilized, then faltered again. Nell's cousins tried to help, but she felt the pressure mounting, the expectation to shoulder more, to be brave, to keep moving forward, even when her heart felt hollowed out by worry. One afternoon, as she returned from the code office, she spotted a familiar figure waiting by the postbox, a neighbor waving an envelope. "For you," the woman called. "From France, I think." Nell's hands shook as she took the letter, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, Sam's words were brief, but the yearning in them was unmistakable. "Dear Nell, your letter reached me. I read it over and over, even as the world spins out of control. I don't know what will happen next, but I carry your words with me. If you can, write again. Yours, Sam." That night, Nell sat awake long after the house was quiet, the letter pressed to her chest. The world outside was uncertain, the war's end nowhere in sight, but in that moment, hope flickered, stubborn as ever. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, her words tumbling out unguarded and true. As she wrote, she wondered how many others were out there clinging to hope through the fragile thread of a letter. How many stories hung in the balance, waiting for a word, a sign, a promise that love could survive the distance. If you find yourself moved by Nell and Sam's story, by the courage of ordinary people holding on to hope in extraordinary times, consider joining our community. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter in their journey, and help us keep these stories of love and resilience alive. After all, sometimes the smallest gestures, a letter, a word, a promise, can bridge even the widest chasms. And perhaps, in sharing these stories, we bring a little more light into the world together. A sharp wind cut across the fields of Yorkshire, bending the wild grasses in trembling waves as Eleanor Whitaker stepped down from the village bus. She pressed her gloved hand to the brim of her felt hat, squinting against the cold and the unfamiliar brightness of open sky. The London fog and soot had faded from her coat, but lingered somehow in her bones, a weight of memories she couldn't shake no matter the distance. The village of Leyburn, with its stone cottages and distant green hills, felt suspended beyond the reach of war, and yet that illusion was as fragile as the morning frost glinting on the hedgerows. Nell's suitcase was heavier than she remembered, its handle biting into her palm. She hesitated at the edge of the muddy track leading to the Linwood farm, heart thudding as if she were about to sit for an exam she hadn't prepared for. After weeks of silence, agonizing, hollow weeks, she had come north, compelled by a desperation she barely understood. She'd read Sam's last letter so many times, the paper was nearly translucent at the creases. Then nothing. No word, not even a field postmark, or a half-censored greeting. The war, relentless and blind, had swallowed his voice. She walked past the dry stone wall, boots crunching on gravel, toward the ivy-choked farmhouse. The front door was painted a faded blue, its frame crooked with age. Nell paused, smoothing her skirt, the memory of Sam's laugh, awkward, earnest, echoing in her mind. Would his family recognize her name? Would they even want to see her, this city stranger who had only known their son through fragile sheets of paper and borrowed lines of poetry? Before her courage could falter, she rapped on the door. Footsteps sounded on the flagstones inside, slow and purposeful. The door swung open, and a woman, tall, broad-shouldered, her hair streaked with silver, regarded Nell with wary curiosity. "Mrs. Linwood?" Nell's voice caught in her throat. "I'm Eleanor Whitaker. Nell, I corresponded with your son, Sam." The woman's face softened, lines of worry easing. "You're Nell," she said. as if confirming a half-remembered song. She opened the door wider. "Come in, love. We've been hoping you'd visit." Inside, the kitchen was warm and fragrant with baking bread. A kettle whistled on the stove, and the low beams overhead were hung with bunches of drying herbs. Nell perched on the edge of a wooden chair as Mrs. Linwood poured tea, her large hands steady in a way that reminded Nell of her own mother before the war, before worry had hollowed her out. "He always wrote about you, Mrs. Linwood said, setting a cup before Nell. "Your letters. He'd keep them in his breast pocket right over his heart. Said reading them felt like coming home, even in the worst places." Nell's eyes stung. She traced the rim of her cup, searching for words. "I haven't heard from him in weeks. I thought perhaps—" The older woman reached across the table, fingertips rough and gentle. "We haven't either. But no news can sometimes be good news, Nell. At least that's what we have to believe." A silence hung between them, the kind shaped by hope and dread in equal measure. Outside, a rooster crowed, oblivious to the ache of waiting. Nell glanced at the mantel, where an old photograph of Sam as a boy, freckled and grinning, holding a battered football, stood beside a faded telegram. Here, in the heart of his childhood, she felt closer to him than she had in months. When Nell left, Mrs. Linwood pressed a loaf of bread into her hands and told her to come again. She walked back to the village with the taste of unshed tears in her mouth, thinking of Sam's last letter, the way he'd signed it not with "yours faithfully" or even "sincerely," but simply, "Ever, Sam." The days passed in a hush of uncertainty. Nell returned to her aunt's cottage each evening, the ache of missing Sam thrumming beneath her skin. She tried to busy herself, sorting ration books, helping at the village school, writing long, careful letters she could not send. At night, she would sit by the window, the world outside shrouded in a darkness unbroken by searchlights or sirens, and imagine Sam somewhere beneath the same stars thinking of her. But sometimes hope soured into bitterness. Why hadn't he written? Had he been wounded? Had he forgotten her in the chaos, found comfort in someone closer, someone real? Nell's mind circled these questions until she grew dizzy with doubt. She would reread his old letters, his neat, looping script, the jokes about Yorkshire rain and London fog, the lines of poetry scrawled in the margins, and try to summon his voice to believe that their connection could survive even this silence. One afternoon, as she fetched water from the pump, a boy from the post office rode up the lane, his bicycle rattling over the stones. He handed her a thin blue envelope, its edges smudged with foreign dust. Nell tore it open with trembling hands, the world narrowing to the familiar shape of Sam's words. But it wasn't his handwriting. "Dear Miss Whitaker, I am writing on behalf of Private Samuel Linwood, who is recovering in our hospital following a minor injury. He dictated this letter to me, as his right hand is currently splintered but healing well. He wishes you to know that he is safe and in good spirits, though he regrets the delay in communication." The letter continued, Sam's words relayed through a stranger's hand. "Nell, I must confess I have never missed anything as fiercely as I've missed your letters, your news, your jokes, the way you remind me there is still good in the world. If I could write myself, I would tell you 1,000 things, about the men here, the songs we sing, the taste of tea in tin mugs, the ache of longing for home. I would tell you how when the pain is bad I imagine your voice reading me poetry, and it hurts less. I would tell you the truth I have learned out here, that hope is a stubborn, reckless thing, and it is you who have taught me to keep it alive. If you can find it in your heart to write me again, I promise, no matter how long it takes, I will answer. Ever, Sam." Nell pressed the letter to her lips, relief and sorrow tumbling together. He was alive. He was hurt, but alive. The distance between them felt both infinite and suddenly achingly small. In the weeks that followed, Nell poured her soul into her letters. She wrote about everything: the first lambs of spring, her father's slow recovery, the way Yorkshire rain sounded against the cottage roof. She wrote about her fears and her dreams, about the future she dared to imagine, one that might include Sam. The act of writing became a prayer, a lifeline thrown across the chasm of war. Sometimes she would receive a reply, sometimes not. When Sam's letters did arrive, they were often brief, scrawled with his left hand, the lines shaky but unmistakably his. In one he enclosed a pressed primrose, yellow petals fragile as hope. In another, he described the hospital gardens where he would sit beneath a tree and imagine her reading aloud. He wrote of the war too in careful, measured words, not of violence but of the small mercies that broke through the darkness. A nurse humming an old hymn, a friend sharing a chocolate bar from home, the sight of a blue sky after days of rain. But as the summer of 1944 deepened, Sam's letters grew less frequent again. The Western Front was shifting, rumours of new offensives swirling through every village and canteen. Nell waited, heart clenched, for each post, counting the days, the empty envelopes, the lines she wished she'd written. One night, as thunder rolled across the moors, Nell sat at her desk, a fresh sheet of paper before her. She had begun and abandoned a dozen letters that week, each torn up and thrown away. The words were too heavy or too raw. She was tired of pretending at bravery. She dipped her pen, the ink pooling, and wrote, "Sam, I am afraid. I am afraid of losing you, of waking each morning to silence. I am afraid that the world will never be what it was. But more than anything, I am afraid of not telling you what is in my heart. I love you. I have loved you since that first night in London, when you thanked me for poetry as if it were a treasure. I love you now, and I will love you, whatever may come." She folded the letter, hands trembling, and addressed it to the last hospital she knew. She posted it before she could change her mind, her cheeks burning with shame and hope. Days stretched into weeks. The world narrowed to waiting. London was a rumour now, distant and battered, but the war's shadow crept even here. Rationed butter, blacked-out windows, news of cousins lost in Arnhem or Anzio. Nell went through the motions, tending the garden, reading to her father, helping at the canteen. Her mind was always elsewhere, chasing the shape of Sam's face, the sound of his voice. Then, late one September afternoon, as she shelved books in her aunt's parlour, there was a knock at the door. Her heart stuttered. She moved to the window, peering through the wavy glass. A figure stood on the stoop, cap in hand, uniform jacket buttoned wrong, hair grown out and wild. He looked thinner, older, the easy smile gone from his lips. But Nell would have known him anywhere. She flung open the door, the scent of rain and wild thyme rushing in. For a moment neither spoke. The silence crackled with all the words unsent, all the nights spent longing. Sam's voice was hoarse, uncertain. "Nell." She took a step toward him, afraid that if she moved too quickly he might vanish like a dream. "You're here." He nodded, eyes shining. "I couldn't stay away, not after your letter. I had to see you to tell you—" His voice broke. Nell reached for his hand, feeling the roughness of new scars beneath her fingers. "You don't have to say it," she whispered. "Not yet." He laughed, shaky and bright. "I want to. I love you, Nell. I have loved you in every muddy trench and hospital ward, through every blasted day. Your letters, they kept me alive." She pressed her forehead to his, the ache of longing giving way to something fierce and sweet. The world outside, the war, the waiting, faded to a hush. They stood together in the doorway, the storm breaking at last. That night, Sam sat by the fire, Nell curled beside him, her head on his shoulder. He told her stories, of friends lost and found, of the nurse who wrote his letters, of the way he'd dreamed of her voice to drown out the fear. She told him of her father's slow healing, of the village's routines, of the hope she'd clung to in the silence. They spoke in low voices as if afraid to startle their happiness. Outside, the fields stretched silver under the moon, the world holding its breath. As autumn passed, Sam's leave was extended. His wounds, while healing, required rest and rehabilitation. They walked the hills, the moors gold and bracken brown, and spoke of the future in careful, tentative words. There was still war, still rationing, still the ache of uncertainty, but together they found a kind of peace. One crisp December morning, as frost rimed the hedges and the village bells tolled faintly, Sam brought Nell to the old stone bridge near the farm. He fumbled in his pocket, retrieving a battered envelope. "I wrote this for you," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a single line written in his uneven script. "Will you marry me, Nell?" She looked up at him, eyes brimming with laughter and tears. "Yes, Sam. I will." Their wedding was small. A handful of neighbours, Mrs. Linwood beaming, Nell's father upright but pale, the village children scattering petals in the churchyard. Sam wore his uniform, medals clinking softly, and Nell a dress borrowed from her cousin, hemmed up and let out in all the wrong places. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate feasts, just bread, jam and laughter, and the promise of a future reclaimed from the wreckage of war. Afterward, as the church bells faded and the guests drifted away, Sam pressed a final letter into Nell's hands. "I started this the night we met," he said. "Kept it with me all this time. It's not much, but—" She unfolded the page, the ink faded but legible. "Nell, if the world were ending, I would still choose you. If I have nothing else, I have your words, and they are enough. Ever yours, Sam." Nell smiled through her tears, the weight of years lifting. "I never stopped writing," he whispered, "even when I couldn't send them." She drew him close, the promise of their letters of hope of home, woven now into the fabric of their lives. And as the first snowfall brushed the Yorkshire fields, Nell realized that love, like hope, was a stubborn, reckless thing. But in the end, it was enough. The last of winter's chill had just begun to loosen its grip on Yorkshire when Nell Whitaker woke to the sound of the postman's whistle. She sat bolt upright in the tiny guest room she'd come to call her own, heart hammering against her ribs, as if it could force the world into giving her what she most wanted. She hurried down the narrow stairs, the old house creaking with each step, and flung open the door before the postman had even finished unlatching the gate. He smiled, a knowing, gentle expression, and handed her a thin, battered envelope, her name written in the familiar, looping hand that had become both her solace and her lifeline. She clutched it to her chest, barely breathing until she was back inside, trembling as she slid a finger beneath the flap. Inside, Sam's words spilled out, halting, uneven, written by a hand still weak from injury but brimming with the clarity of a man who had come through darkness and found his anchor. He wrote of the hospital's high, sterile windows, the nurse who'd helped him hold the pen, the memory of her laughter echoing in his dreams. He wrote of the fields at dawn, the hush of the world right before the sun crested the hills, and how in those moments it wasn't the war or the pain he thought of, but the steady, gentle presence of Nell, her letters, her poetry, the hope she'd given him when hope seemed foolish. He ended simply, "I do not know what tomorrow brings, but I know I want to face it with you. If you'll have me, Nell, let's not let the world decide for us any longer." Nell pressed the letter to her lips, tears of relief and joy and fear mingling on her cheeks. For so long, she had lived in the in-between, waiting for news, for permission to hope, for the war to end before she allowed herself to imagine a future. But the war, she realized, would end when it ended. Life, with all its uncertainty and beauty, would not wait. With renewed resolve, she sat at the kitchen table, pen poised above paper, hands steadier than they'd been in months. Her letter in reply was brief, but every word was chosen with care. Yes, Sam. Yes to tomorrow. Yes to all of it. Come home to me. Weeks passed, the world turning slowly toward peace. In the Yorkshire village, whispers of armistice drifted through the streets like the scent of lilacs on a spring breeze. Nell busied herself in the bookshop, tending to her father's needs, feeling the weight of anticipation in every passing day. The war was winding down, and with each headline, each distant cheer, she let herself believe a little more in the possibility of reunion. Then one golden afternoon, as she arranged a window display, old poetry volumes and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Hope endures," she heard the clatter of boots on cobblestones. She turned, heart in her throat, and there he was. Sam Linwood, thinner than she remembered, a cane in one hand but eyes bright and alive, a crooked smile spreading across his face as if he could barely believe the sight of her. For a moment they simply stared at one another, the silence full of all the words they'd written, all the longing and loss and fragile hope. Then she stepped forward, and he opened his arms, and the world, for a few precious seconds, felt whole again. They walked together along the edge of the moor, the spring sun warm on their backs, speaking quietly of all that had passed, what they'd lost and what they'd found. Sam told her of late nights in the trenches, clutching her letters like talismans. Nell confessed the ache of waiting and the strength she'd discovered in the rhythm of her days, in the comfort of words and work, and the knowledge that she was not alone. "I used to wonder," Sam said, pausing beneath a flowering hawthorn, "if I'd ever really come home again. Not just to a place, but to a life. To someone who remembered who I was before all this. Nell took his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm, the tremor still lingering from his wounds. "You never left," she whispered. "Not really. Not from here." She touched his heart, her own racing beneath her fingers. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Then let's not waste another moment." Their wedding was small, as so many were in those uncertain days. A gathering in the village church, wildflowers from the fields, the pews filled with neighbors and friends who had weathered so much together. Nell wore a dress borrowed from her cousin, the hem let down to fit. Sam stood tall in his uniform, the medals on his chest a quiet testament to all he'd endured. As they exchanged vows, Nell felt the weight of every letter, every night spent listening for the drone of bombers, every quiet dawn when she'd wondered whether hope was an act of foolishness or defiance. She looked into Sam's eyes and knew with a certainty that went deeper than words that love was not about the absence of fear or suffering, but about choosing, again and again, to reach for the small, bright things, the laughter in a darkened canteen, the promise in a line of poetry, the steady beat of a heart that refused to give in. When the ceremony was over, they walked hand in hand into the sunlight, the village bells pealing overhead. The world was still battered, still uncertain, but in that moment, Nell felt a fierce, unshakable hope, the kind that endures not in spite of sorrow, but because of it. In the months that followed, as peace settled slowly over the country, Nell and Sam built their life together from the remnants of war. The bookshop was rebuilt, shelves restocked with volumes old and new. Sam returned to teaching, his classroom filled with the laughter and questions of children who had known too much fear, too soon. At night, they read aloud to each other by lamplight, the words of poets and dreamers echoing through the small rooms like a prayer. But some things, Nell insisted, should never change. Every week she wrote Sam a letter, a habit born in necessity, now cherished as ritual. Sometimes she left them tucked between the pages of his books, sometimes slipped into his coat pocket, each one a reminder that love, once found, must be tended, nourished, kept alive even in the quietest days. Sam, for his part, never failed to reply. His notes were shorter now, sometimes just a scribbled line or two, but each one carried the same truth, that even in a world scarred by war, connection was possible. That hope, once given, could be returned, a kind of homecoming all its own. Years later, long after the world had moved on and new worries had replaced old ones, Nell would look back on those days and marvel at the courage it had taken, not just to survive, but to love. She would remember the trembling of her hands as she opened each letter, the ache of waiting, the sweetness of reunion. She would remember standing in the ruins of her city, believing against all reason that something good could endure. She would remember most of all the simple, indelible fact that every act of reaching out, every letter, every word, every moment of vulnerability had mattered, that in the darkness it was not grand gestures or bold declarations that saved them, but the quiet, persistent insistence on hope. And if anyone asked, "How did you do it? How did you find the strength?" she would smile and say, "We wrote our way through, word by word, day by day, and in the end, we found each other." If you've listened all the way to the end of Nell and Sam's story, thank you. Their journey through uncertainty, separation, and hope is a reminder that even in the hardest times, love can endure. And sometimes it's the smallest acts, a letter, a kind word, that make all the difference. Which moments resonated with you the most? Do you have a story of hope or connection from your own family's past? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and consider subscribing for more true-to-life tales of love, resilience, and hope from history. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. After all, in a world that's always changing, we all need reminders that hope endures, and sometimes a story is all it takes to bring us home.